And good afternoon. And I am well, thrilled doesn't begin. Thrilled doesn't even begin to say it here. Um, we have a legend here in the field of reading, P. David Pearson. I've been studying him since the Red Sea Parted, I think, almost. And he is incredibly well written and has influenced the field of reading in incredible ways. So I'm going to stop talking now and ask him first to just give us a little bit about his background and credentials, and then we'll get into some talking points. So here we go. And Dr. Pearson, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Sam. It's a real treat to be a part of your uh, programming and podcasting. I know by reputation all that you do, and I'm grateful to be at least a small part of your efforts to keep sanity and some sort of notion of a centrist philosophy of teaching, reading uppermost in people's minds. How did I get into all this? Well, I grew up in rural areas of Northern California, a lot of different schools. My father worked on highways, so every time he got a new job, we moved, and I ended up going to nine elementary schools in 8 years. I was always a new kid on the block, and I had to adapt to a lot of different environments. And I guess I'm grateful for that in the sense that it's made me a very adaptable and hopefully nimble person. Nimble in the sense that I can respond to new situations and the like. I ended up going to Berkeley as an undergrad, and after I graduated, I had nothing in mind but to become a history professor because I loved history and the like. That didn't work out money-wise. I got married at the time, like so many did right after college in the early 60s, and needed some money. And there were these areas of California that were hard up for teachers, and they would give you a credential on a provisional basis if you had a bachelor's degree and were breathing. And I met those criteria. I had an undergraduate degree in history with minors in philosophy and English, and I ended up as a fifth grade teacher in small town Porterville, California, halfway between Fresno and Bakersfield. And it was my inability to really reach the kids. Half of my class were bilingual at the time, and this was before bilingual education was even a word. But we started doing the best we could with those kids, and I took courses on how to teach reading. And I took a course from this guy named John Manning, who was at Fresno State. Mm-hmm. And it was in one of those, it was in Visalia. It was an extension course. At the end of the course, he said to me, he said, "Pearson, I like the cut of your jib. If you're ever interested in studying this business of reading and language for real," he said, I'm leaving Fresno State and going to Minnesota. Write me." 2 years later, I did, and the rest is history. I did my doctorate at Minnesota, got really interested in issues of children's, first of all, decoding, because everyone was doing decoding, and they were doing the first grade studies at Minnesota. And so I was right in the middle of all that work in the 60s. But then I got interested in comprehension and how it is you help kids understand and critique what they read. And that's been the driving force throughout virtually all of my career. And I ended up teaching at Minnesota. Then I went to the University of Illinois for many years, 17 years, 6 years at Michigan State, and back to UC Berkeley, where I started out as an undergraduate and spent 19 years at Illinois. So I've been a college professor. I was a college professor for 48 years, and now I'm trying to stay retired, but not doing very well at it. The science of reading has sort of kept me busy over the last several years and trying to respond to all the rhetoric surrounding it. But I'm happy to be here with you and happy that you're doing so much good work to make sure that we're all aware of what the issues are in this craziness that we're experiencing.
And it's almost, I think in our pre-talk, I was talking about being deja vu all over again. We've been in similar situations before. So I've got some questions to ask, and I'll just do them one at a time. And if
Sure, that's great.
if any other things come to mind, please interject. But let's start with why social cultural models of reading are needed to ensure that students receive a comprehensive curriculum. So what are your thoughts around that?
Well, that's interesting because I didn't start out as emphasizing the social and cultural background and context as an important part of understanding how kids learn how to read and how we ought to teach it and the like. I actually started out thinking that most things that mattered happened, between the ears and behind the eyes and inside the head. And in the 60s when I started, that's all we looked at. Gradually over time, as we got into the 70s, I started saying, there's more to it than just what goes on there. And that's when we got into cognitive psychology and developed schema theory and all these sort of ideas about text structure and what it is that you carried around in your head to help you understand what you were reading, and the idea of schemas, or these ideas or concepts that sort of organize your thinking and your memory and stuff like that, became very, very important. And so that was the 70s and into the 80s. And into the 80s, that's when I discovered that it was hard to figure out how it is you would respond to kids' needs in learning to read without taking into account where they lived, what their cultural background was, their as Louise Malle called it, funds of knowledge that kids from different environments bring to classrooms and the like. That's also about the time we just developed culturally responsive pedagogy. Geneva Gay and Gloria Ladson Billings brought those concepts to us. And over time in the 80s and the 90s, I became much more aware of just how important it was to understand where the kid was coming from, what cultural assets and also traditions and practices that they brought to the classroom, and understanding how we can transform those cultural practices into resources that we could use not only to help that particular kid learn how to read and write, but to help all the kids in the classrooms learn how to read and write. So making a virtue out of cultural variability, if you will, and the like. And what's so interesting is that, for the last, decade, we've had a lot of reports coming, particularly from the science of reading, about the importance of looking at what happens inside the head, at the brain, as kids learn how to read. And we've had all of the fMRI imaging, and people have made the point that parts of the brain that have to do with phonological processing, looking at how we say words and how we take into account the phonemes and stuff like that when we read. And from that, we've concluded that when you read, you go from letters to the sounds they represent to some sort of meaning representation. But what the science of reading has failed to take into account is that there's a whole other branch called the science of learning and development. And the people who work in that have been doing these brainwave studies too. And what they find is that when kids are learning things, not just reading, but learning things in general, like content and social studies or science, that when they make connections with cultural, resources and knowledge that they bring, that parts of the brain light up there too. So there's this whole other thing going on with the science of learning and development, where they're doing the same kind of brainwave studies that the science of reading people do, but their studies implicate the importance of sociocultural factors in all sorts of learning. So I think until these two sort of neuroscience lines of work get together and sort of look at how they inform one another, I think we're going to be having some of these debates that we seem to have endlessly and the like. But I come at it not from the brainwave thing. For me, the reason you study the cultural backgrounds and assets that kids bring to the classroom is so that you can provide better instruction that is more asset-based than deficit-based. So for me, we do the sociocultural perspective because it emphasizes the resources that kids bring not only for their own learning, but to help with the learning of other people at the same time. So for me, it's a no-brainer. We can't teach reading effectively unless we find ways to privilege the assets that all learners bring to the classroom.
I'm sorry, I thought I had my phone blocked, but apparently not. I'm going to put a little plug in here for a friend of mine. Julius Anthony in my area runs something he calls the Believe Project. And I'm going to send you a link to that. And it's just amazing. He has well over a dozen well-stocked libraries, and he's the president of the St. Louis Black Authors. And I think his work here in St. Louis might be worth looking at. Want to make some of your friends aware of that as well. Getting books into the hands of children, and it's just an amazing project. So having put that plug in there, I'm going to go on to the next question, which is learning to read an unnatural act?
Before I do that, can I just pick up on one thing that I should have said when talking about sociocultural? I think the upshot of it is, and what's really important for teachers, is that when kids go to school, they need to have an opportunity to see themselves in the curriculum. But the other thing that we all need is an opportunity to see others. So the curriculum has to be, on the one hand, culturally responsive to the assets and cultural practices that represent our differences amongst one another. But the curriculum also needs to be multicultural in the sense that we all need to see others in the curriculum as well. So there's that kind of balancing act between seeing yourself and seeing others that I think is so important. And I just wanted to make that point. Onto the issue of whether learning to read is a natural act. And this, of course, comes from Phil Goff, and I think his partner was Hillinger at the time, wrote an article in the late 70s or early 80s. I'm blocking on the exact date, called Learning to Read, an Unnatural Act. And the point they were trying to make is that this was happening at a time during the cognitive and psycholinguistic revolution in psychology, when working on, from Noam Chomsky's idea that we all come pre-wired to learn whatever language, oral language we happens to be part of the cultural setting in which we reside, that learning to talk and learning to speak the language of our cultural community is a natural thing. We do it without anyone teaching it explicitly or directly. All we need is to hang out in that situation, to be in a communicative setting with our family and with friends and with other peers and the like. And presto, by the time we reach age 2, we're beginning to use the language of the culture in which we grow up. And by the time we're 4 or 5, we're pretty competent at oral language. We can get along in the world. And if we hang around schools long enough, we not only learn to talk everyday English, we learn to talk academic English and the like. And no one teaches it explicitly, of course, until we get to our language arts classes in the intermediate grades in high school and the like. So the idea is that learning to speak is natural. Learning to read, however, is not regarded as natural, because if you just hang out in environments and are bathed with books without some explicit attention to the symbols and how those symbols represent the oral language that you spent the better part of your life learning naturally, you won't learn to read. It isn't just a question of hanging out in literate environments. There has to be some explicit attempt on the part of a more knowledgeable other, most often a teacher, to help you discover the cipher, the map that maps written symbols onto oral language. And the thought is that therefore learning to read requires systematic, explicit instruction in how letters map onto sounds. And if you can map the letters onto sounds, then you can use your oral language competence to do what? Figure out what those things mean. So it goes from symbol, that's the grapheme, to sound, that's the phoneme. And from there it goes, and from there you can sort of listen to what you say and figure out what it means. And that's the perceived, that's why learning to read is regarded as unnatural and therefore must be taught. Well, there's another perspective on this. First of all, a lot of people who wanted to say that learning to read is more natural than that and is more like learning oral language. And I suppose the two biggest theoretical proponents of that point of view are Ken Goodman. Well, I would say Ken and Yetta together because they both were responsible for pushing that point of view. And I think Frank Smith in his writing also represented the theoretical perspective that if we regarded learning to read as a more natural activity and took advantage of the opportunities we have in everyday environments for kids to be exposed to and learn how print helps us get things done in the world, that we'd all be better off. So while it isn't exactly like learning to speak, we could operate a lot less arbitrarily and a lot more naturally in terms of just making print a part of everyday life in kids' existences. My own perspective is something like this. We learn things in the world partially through a process of discovery, partially through a process of explicit teaching and telling on the part of other people. So that let's take learning about dinosaurs. What do you have to do to learn about dinosaurs? Well, you've got to be exposed to some content about dinosaurs, right? And you have to learn how to discriminate one kind of dinosaur from another and things like that. And sometimes you do that by looking at picture books, and sometimes you do that by having people read to you, and sometimes you do that by reading on your own and the like. And through the process of all those experiences, some of which are real world experiences, some of which are experiences with books and the like, we come to know about dinosaurs. We also learn how to count, and we learn how to do math problems and the like. And again, that's through a process of being guided by others and through a process of, doing some things on their own. And I think learning to read is as natural as learning anything else we encounter in our worlds. And I think in putting forth the proposition that learning to read is an unnatural act, that it disposes us as teachers to feel like kids are entirely reliant on our telling them and guiding them exactly in every step along the way in the process of learning to read. And I think that's a mistake. I think to the degree that we can help kids become more independent in those acts as quickly as possible, we'll all be better off. So for me, learning to read is as natural as learning just about everything else in the world, except for language. And I think language does come pre-wired. But just about everything else, learning to read is no more or less natural than learning to do a million other things we learn how to do in life, even riding bicycles, how to do somersaults, things like that. So.
Well, to clarify then, you see a role for both direct instruction and for discovery kinds of instruction. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes, and I put the emphasis on helping kids develop independent control over these kinds of processes as quickly as you possibly can. Yes, I would say that uh, what I used to say in the late 80s and early, I mean, not late 80s, in the late 90s and early 2000s, when we were, in the throes of No Child Left Behind, is there's no reason why authentic activity, the idea that reading things that are real things and the like, not reading instructional text, but reading real text, there's no reason why authentic activity and ambitious instruction ought to be antagonistic to one another. I think you can have ambitious instruction and authentic activity, reading real text for real purposes and the like, all in the same curriculum. And that's one thing that I've always tried to push. And authentic activity, I think, leads us to a situation where we maximize the opportunities for kids to discover patterns of regularity and the like. So to me, it's all about learning patterns of regularity and being able to use those patterns to predict what we're going to do the next time we encounter, a new word or encounter a new idea or the like. So for me, it's all about authenticity.
For me as a teacher, and I was teaching at the time you wrote this article about gradual release of responsibility, and then I was teaching through the time when teachers were trying to make sense of it and actually make use of it, and it basically transformed, in my opinion, the education world. And there are many a lesson to be learned from that idea of gradual release. So and part of it is that if you're truly using gradual release, the end product is a child that has internalized whatever it is you've been trying to teach him. That all said, talk about gradual release, its impact. It's your that reading teacher article. I see that as a watershed article in the reading world. So just talk about the whole business of gradual release and how it should be, is being applied. And by the way, before you say a word, an incredible thank you from every teacher on the planet for coming up with that. And I know it wasn't just you, but it has transformed the way teachers teach.
Well, a couple of things about it. First of all, I never thought in the late 70s and early 80s, when that construct was evolving from a group of us who were working at the University of Illinois at the Center for the Study of Reading, I never thought it would take off the way it did. Yeah, of all the things I've done, that's captured more attention on the part of more people than anything else. And that diagram of the gradual release, it is the single most requested reprint of anything I've ever done in my entire career. More so than any other, sort of significant article or anything like that. So at any rate, so I guess the point is that the gradual release of responsibility came about in a certain context. I had just gone to the Center for the Study of Reading at the University of Illinois in 1978. And at that year, Dolores Durkin, who was a colleague there at the Center for the Study of Reading, brought out a watershed article, very influential article, in which she and her colleagues had observed some 14,000, minutes or hours. I think it was minutes of classroom instruction in the intermediate grades 4, 5, and 6 in elementary schools. And what she was doing was looking for situations in which could be defined as comprehension instruction, where what a teacher did was to do or to say something to a group of students that would give them some kind of tool for doing some kind of comprehension activity, answering questions, writing a summary, whatever task it was they were doing. She was looking for guidance on the part of teachers. What she found was I think was some ungodly small amount, like 110 minutes of all that 14,000 minutes of instruction actually could be considered that kind of guidance, anything direct or explicit instruction. What she found instead was was practice, and practice was in answering questions about the text. So comprehension, it consisted in the curricula that she observed and in the basal readers that she looked at. Comprehension consisted of asking kids questions and then giving them feedback on whether their answers were correct or incorrect. That was it. So what we were looking for was some way of conceptualizing what it would mean to actually be instructive, to do something that was helpful, to do something that provided scaffolding, that provided some kind of structure that kids could use as a way of predicting what it is they might have to do with a comprehension task. And so that's when we came up with this idea of the gradual release of responsibility. And it turned out that there were two really important colleagues at the center, Anne Brown and Joe Campione. And Anne Brown is someone you associate with Anne Marie Pallingsar in reciprocal teaching, right? That came along a few years later. At any rate, in our conversations, noontime conversations with them, we talked about what it would mean to provide instruction in reading comprehension. And we said, well, you can start off by modeling. And we said, well, that's all good, but start out by modeling. You're just doing it for the kids. And then I said, or you could start out by giving them the task to do. And we said, well, that's the other end. You're just asking them to do it, and you're providing absolutely no guidance and the like. So what would it mean to get from a situation where you were doing everything and the kids were doing nothing to a situation where they were doing everything and you were doing nothing? And it's what comes in the middle that really mattered. And so we conceptualized that as a set of participation structures. So you would go from modeling to collaborative joint activity, to facilitating, to sort of observing and participating, and just being, like any other student in the room and the like. So the point is that you would slide up and down the scale from all teacher to all student, and and it was that middle part where you work together on things that really mattered a lot. And so that's what we put forward as a model, and it seemed to work, and it provided a good explanation for a lot of the work that the students I was working with at that time, Jane Hansen, Chris Gordon, Meg Gallagher, Taffy Raphael, they all were doing instructional studies where teachers were gradually fading the salience and the directness of the cues that they provided and giving the kids more and more leeway in terms of being independent on their own and the like. And gradually over time, and other people got involved, and the thing just blew up on us. And I actually think that when Anne Marie and Anne did the reciprocal teaching, that people really glommed onto that idea and the like. And over time, we realized the shortcomings of it. The first shortcoming of it is that it's too linear. That's not the way instruction doesn't work, where you do everything and the kids do nothing, and then each day they might take a little bit more responsibility and then they're independent. Yeah, there's a thing called Friday and there's a thing called weekends. You come back the next Monday, and you have to be back up halfway up that scale because the kids have forgotten and the like. So a good teacher is very nimble at moving up and down that scale. And you move up and down that scale, like some kids need more guidance than other kids, right? You got 8 kids in a reading group, and some of them need a lot of help, and some of them don't need very much help at all. You have a story that's highly familiar, you barely have to provide any scaffolding at all. You got a story that's got content that's really abstract or unfamiliar to the students. What do you find? You got to get in there and provide a lot more guidance. So what we learned about the gradual release of responsibility is it has to be conceptualized as much more flexible, nimble, and adaptable than a simple we do everything down to we do nothing model. And so over time, we've learned about that. And there have been some other people who I think have I think, done good work to suggest that to get around its linearity. I ran across this concept recently. I just can't remember the name of the people, but who did it. But they talk about what is it that they talk about? Kind of like it's uh, it's not exactly shared responsibility, but it's the notion that it's putting the notion that it's not the release of responsibility, it's the acceptance of responsibility on the part of the kid that matters. And that in the GRR, we put too much emphasis on the teacher, and we should have put more emphasis on the kid. The other thing that I've learned over time is that it's probably good to start off where you just give a kid a task and see what they can do before you draw the inference that you need to be all the way up at the modeling phase. For many kids, you don't have to operate at the modeling phase at all. You can go right into one of those collaborative, facilitating kinds of stages of instruction, because through their own experience, they've already got some level of grasp of the task that they're supposed to do. So we shouldn't assume that at the beginning of a unit that you have to do everything. Okay, we should find out what kids can do, use that as feedback for figuring out where on that scale we need to operate.
And I would mention that our mutual friend, Tim Rosinski, has come up with a wonderful concept of the art in teaching of science. And I know you've done some work around that with him, and that it is both, and you need both.
Well, I would make an even stronger statement, and that is that there's a backdrop of science in every work of art. Work of art isn't just unbridled creativity. Artists have tools, and they have structure, and they have discipline, and they don't get everything right the first time. So there's a kind of a scientific aura that permeates, I think, all art. And conversely, scientists, when they're in the process of doing their work, often make great discoveries through epiphanies that are not easily explained by the scientific method. That is, they just sort of all came together at once. So there's a lot of inside of not art in science, as well as a lot of science behind art.
Okay. Wow. Next, the importance of definitions and reading and establishing instructional priorities. I think you've alluded to that somewhat for teachers and learning, but the importance of the definition of reading and establishing instructional priorities. I'm sorry. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I guess what I would say about all this is that when it comes to teaching reading, the definition that you start off with matters a whole lot. Let me give you a couple of definitions, and then we'll look at the implications of them. There's a seminal article that's authored by legends in the psychology of reading: Keith Rayner, Barbara Forman, Chuck Perfetti, David Kosetsky, and Mark Seidenberg. And you recognize particularly Forman and Seidenberg's names because they've been very involved in the science of reading debates. It was published the same year as the National Reading Panel Report, 2000. It's called How Psychological Science Informs the Teaching of Reading. And it's a watershed piece because it gives a very particular definition of reading. And what they argue in this paper is that it's important to have a very narrow definition of reading. And they picked one that says, in focusing on reading's distinguishing features, we define learning to read as the acquisition of knowledge that results in the child being able to identify and understand printed words that he or she knows on the basis of spoken language, right? Identify and understand printed words, not sentences, not paragraphs, not whole text, printed words. So what this definition, and this is underlying almost all of the science of reading stuff that we see in print that Emily Hanford talks about all the time. If you start off with that definition, then your focus on the teaching of reading is going to be on what? Doing everything you can to help kids get printed words off the printed page into their own oral language so that they can sort of listen to what they say and understand it the same way that they understand oral language when they hear it and the like. So what do people infer from that pedagogically? Well, probably that should be the number one task in learning to read, right? Learning that cipher, that code that maps printed language onto oral language. Now let me give you another definition. This is from a 2020 piece by Pat Alexander. It was in that, there's 2 issues of RRQ.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, 2020 and 2021. This is from Pat Alexander's piece. The reality is that reading does not begin or end with phonics or whole word instruction. It is far broader and more complex. Reading, broadly conceived, is any interaction between a person, be it a child, adolescent, or adult, and written language. That interaction can involve written language at many levels, from words and sentences to paragraphs and entire volumes. Also, reading can be performed for many reasons, from purely personal to largely academic, and in many contexts, both in and out of school, as well as online or in print. Now, that's another definition of reading. And where does that take you? Just listen to all the things that were in there. It's far broader and more complex. It's an interaction. It can be performed for many reasons, personal, academic, in and out of many contexts and the like. And where does that take you if you think about the implications? It takes you to a broader notion of what your responsibilities are in teaching and reading, right? You got to worry about all these purposes and contexts and settings, and they're not all the same. Here's another one, and this one I like because I helped work on it. It's the 2026 definition of reading in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Reading comprehension is making meaning with text. A complex process is shaped by many factors, including readers' abilities to engage with print and multimodal forms, to employ personal resources that include foundational reading skills, that's the phonics, language, knowledge, and motivations, and extract, construct, integrate, critique, and apply meaning in activities across a range of social and cultural contexts. See the sociocultural coming in there, what we talked about earlier? It's right there in the definition. And these latter 2 definitions, the one by Pat Alexander and the one by Nate, lead us, I think, into a very different, much broader pedagogical perspective than does the first one. And as a matter of fact, the folks at Rayner and the other colleagues who wrote the narrow definition, it's not that they don't think that these other things are important. Here's what they say about these other things. To see the value of the narrow definition, the one that says that reading is just identifying and understanding words that are part of your oral language. To see the value of the narrow definitions, it's useful to make a distinction between literacy and reading. Literacy dispositions toward learning includes a variety of educational outcomes, interest in reading and writing, knowledge of subject matter domains that go beyond reading. These dimensions of literacy entail the achievement of a broad range of skills embedded in cultural and technological contexts. An extended functional definition is useful in helping to make clear the wide range of literacy tasks a society might present to its members. So what have they done? They have defined all this other stuff out of reading. That's part of literacy, it's part of learning, but it's not part of reading. And what that does is it makes the reading curriculum a much narrower swath than I think most of us think is involved in reading. I mean, if you look at the teaching of reading today, it includes a lot of this other stuff, and it certainly includes a focus on comprehension, on motivation, on purpose for reading, and the like. So I just think that what the folks in the science of reading are doing is they're just picking off one little piece of reading, and they're saying that that's what matters most, and that's what we should pay attention to. We'll get to the other stuff, but we don't have to get to it in the reading curriculum. You can do that in social studies or science, or this sort of broad notion of literacy for everyday life, but it's not part of reading. So I think the definition matters a whole lot.
Okay, which I think is a perfect segue into the next thing I'd like for you to talk about. Whoa, it's me. I've stopped the video at this point, and we'll pick it up again next week. And I'm going to share with you in just a second what kind of things we'll be talking about next week then. First, in this next section, David's going to talk about DIBELS. He's going to indicate it's a test of progress monitoring. It's a test of progress monitoring that takes a very narrow view of what fluency is, doesn't consider prosody the way Rosinski's measures do, and it's most definitely not a direct test of comprehension. Next, he'll talk about the 3 cueing systems. He'll point out that those cues are actually found in many of the models of reading used by SOR advocates. He also points out that good readers tend to make miscues that are more contextually constrained. Well, how can that be if good readers aren't using the 3 cueing systems? And pretty well, that fact is not compatible with the fact that only poor readers use the 3 cues. He'll also talk about Scanlon's research around context, and that's considerable. He'll talk about how there are many approaches to teaching phonics, and that he has no objections to kids and teachers alike learning those various approaches. And finally, he finishes with what I think is a very good plan for how to possibly end these reading wars. He sees the keys to ending them as getting folks to start talking positions rather than taking sides. So the soundbite for that: take positions, not sides. We have to listen to one another. To get the full story of what all is going to be said next week, you have to tune in. So please do. So until next week, this is Dr. B signing off. Thank you for listening to this video.